This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by the Deadly Faith Podcast. Hey, heathens, I'm Lacey.
And I'm Lola.
And if you're deconstructing your faith and love true crime, then you need to subscribe to our show. On this podcast, we explore the world where religion and crime collide. We venture deep into cults, serial killers, and much more.
Now, this world isn't full of sunshine and rainbows, but it's a world that needs to be explored. We're excited to bring truth to light, so get ready for some deep dives and some funny commentary as we tell these religious true crime tales. The Deadly Faith Podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Liminal. A word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I am your curator of conversations, Dr. Tom Rundell. And today, the conversation I have curated for you, we got to talk with Dr. Steve Harper. Dr. Steve is a retired seminary professor who taught for more than 30 years in the disciplines of spiritual formation and Wesleyan studies. He's taught in colleges, universities, seminaries in the United States and elsewhere around the world. Steve received his PhD in Wesley studies from Duke University in 1981. He holds an MDiv and a BA also. And he's authored and co-authored many, many books. Steve has been married to his wife Jeannie since 1970, and they have 2 grown children and 3 grandchildren. Now, I was connected to Steve by a friend of mine, Paul Jones, who said, "You need to know this man. We named our child Harper after him." And I am so glad that we got connected. He was such a delightful person to talk to, like a true elder in the real meaning of the word, one who's developed wisdom to pass on to the next generation. And he spent his life doing just that. And now in his retirement, he's writing and publishing books. Now, if you'd like to watch the video of this interview, you can see his bubbly personality. You can see his amazing glasses and awesome shirt. And you can also see the quilt that is behind our conversation that his grandmother made him and handed down to him. And it serves as a great illustration of the kinds of diverse conversations he likes to have. That video is over on our YouTube page, so you can go on over there and subscribe to that page if you'd like to stay connected with the videos we put out. Now, in our conversation today, we discussed spiritual formation in the modern day church, where it is lacking, and the inspiration behind his book that we talked about called Jesus Unpainted. He delves into the layers of interpretation that have been applied to Jesus over the years, and like layers of paint on a nice antique piece of furniture. And we need to strip away these layers to reveal the true essence of Christ underneath. And some of those paint layers that we explore is the modern day challenge of countering Christian nationalism, the importance of speaking truth in love and confidence to that group in the midst of a church that is being led astray into that realm. Additionally, we delve into the conversation on the nature of God as love and its implications for how we live out our faith in this world. We explore the role of faith in modern society and a post-Christian world, and the challenges faced by the LGBTQ community within our religious spaces, and why we should be more inclusive and accessible to them in our spaces. We dive into the need of the church to do local community engagement beyond mere evangelism, and the qualities of a gentle leader who can organize a community in that direction without getting their ego all tied up in it all. So it was a wonderful, rich, wise, beautiful conversation. So without any more words from me, I want to introduce you to Dr. Steve Harper, because he is really such a delight, challenging our established ways of thinking in just the right way and with a healthy dose of love in his words. So here's my conversation with Dr. Steve Harper. right, we officially started. Well, Dr. Steve Harper, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be with you, Tom.
I'm thankful that we figured out after 26 minutes our technical
Yeah,
difficulties, but
isn't
we
that
got
right?
it.
I mean, I guess even a low-tech guy like me we can finally get on board.
It worked. It finally worked. So I couldn't
There
figure
you
it
go.
out either, but it
That's right.
eventually worked itself out. Well, where do you find yourself in the world today?
Well, I'm living in Florida and am enjoying the life of retirement. I've been retired 12 years. I'll be 77 in October. And I kind of jokingly say I finally found the job I've been looking for all my life. Uh, and it's given me time, I guess, to ponder things that I used to just kind of write down on a to-do list when I got through with all my meetings. So it's a happy time. My wife and I have been married 54 years, and we have two cats still with us here at home. So each day is fun, and it's an adventure. We've got two adult children living out different places in the United States with their families. It's a good time for us.
Oh, nice. And I see, like, I always like to look at someone's background, and I see that you've got a really cool quilt, and you were telling me a little bit about it. You want to give us some information on
Yeah,
that?
this is my grandmother's quilt, and the fact that I'm 77 years old leads me to think it's at least and probably more than 100 years old.
Yeah.
It could, I guess, be approaching 125 years or so, and it's one of those patchwork quilts that women of that day used to get together and do quilting bees. I think they still have versions of it today, and I often come in here. This is just one of our ordinary rooms. It's not anything particular other than we wanted to put the quilt here. It's where I do a lot of the broadcasting podcasts and that kind of thing. So people like you see it, call attention to it. But I come in here, I often stand and look at it and wonder, whose clothing it was and wonder what they were talking about when they were putting it all together.
Yeah.
It's one of those things, if the quilt could talk, it would probably tell a very interesting story.
Yeah. I wonder how many different people's stories are represented in that huge
Oh, I know.
array.
Isn't that the truth? Probably happened up in the Texas Panhandle somewhere because they lived up in that area when in their younger married days. So my guess is it was some Texas Panhandle farmer and rancher spouses who put it together.
Yeah. Well, who are you and what do you do? Like, what did you retire from, I should say?
Yeah. Well, I retired after more than 30 years of teaching in seminaries. My primary teaching discipline was spiritual formation. My PhD from Duke is on Wesley spirituality, and that's kind of how the two come together. And I also taught some of the introductory courses to Wesleyan theology. In addition to being a faculty member, I was the founding vice president and dean for the Asbury campus that opened here in Orlando in 1998. And I served in a kind of administrative and faculty capacity until I retired in 2012. So in addition to that, I'm ordained as an elder in the United Methodist Church. Currently a member in the Florida Annual Conference, have been for some time. Prior to that, I was born, raised, and ordained initially in the Northwest Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, which sadly now no longer exists because of all the disaffiliations in that conference. But that's another story. We're here for something else besides that. But that
Yeah.
gives you a little background. I guess you'd say Texan by birth and nurture for a long time, but we're starting 27 years in Florida, so we've been here a while too.
Oh, well, you still got your Matthew McConaughey accent going on from Texas. So
Thank you.
I hear that.
Thank you. I'm proud of that. That's good. I like to hear you say that.
Yeah, well, you've written a pretty cool book. You have Jesus Unpainted, and I got to read that over this past weekend and kind of reflect on it. What inspired this book?
Yeah.
What you talk about a lime green bedroom that
Yeah.
inspired the book.
What inspired the book really was kind of a linguistic, and then I would say kind of a theological or societal. Those two things came together. On the linguistic side, I would say I've become more and more fascinated with the power and truth of metaphor. I'm a pretty left brain kind of guy, and words have always been important to me. I guess as a writer, they have to be and should be. But I was sort of, just the facts. Let's cut to the facts. Word studies, that kind of thing, were and still are important to me. But I've discovered a whole genre of writing and a whole genre of theology that takes the language of metaphor as seriously or even more seriously, say, than historical factual kind of writing. And that's been very important to me. And I guess the way that it fed into the little book, Jesus Unpainted, is that for some time I have believed that Christ has indeed been painted over inside the church and also outside the church with layers of interpretation that don't correspond to the Jesus of the Gospels. Now, that's a big issue. It goes all the way back to Albert Schweitzer and the historical Jesus movement and all that kind of stuff. So we can't get into that, and I'm not, trained to get into all that, except to say that it's this feeling that Jesus got blurred or painted over in the process has been in the minds of people for a long, long time. So when I began to try to make sense of that, particularly through the times in which we're passing, when the Christ and culture contest that's going on right now in our country, that metaphor of the lime green furniture came into my mind, and that became, I said, oh, I can work with that. And so what Jeannie did back in the day was to literally, with Formby's polisher, she worked her way down through all the layers until we got to the real wood. I mean, we didn't know what we were going to find there. Will we find junk? Will we find marred furniture? What will we find? Well, we found beauty. It was an amazing thing when she hollered one day, "Come, Steve, come quick, look at this." And there was beautiful wood. Well, it still took weeks to get it all off so that we could see all of the good wood. But it was just a reminder that came back to me of a real life experience that says to me, if we can stay with Jesus, that is, keep Christ at the center. And I'm very serious about that, because I think Christology is the center of Christianity, and everything else is on the circumference of that circle. But if we can do that, if we're willing to keep wiping, we are going to get to Goodwood Jesus. And hopefully Jesus Unpainted. What I do, as you know, is I work through the fruit of the Spirit. And I go back and forth. I say, Jesus manifested the fruit of the Spirit, and because he did, we can too. Each chapter kind of alternates in that way, so that you get a look at Goodwood Jesus, and hopefully you get a good look at what our spiritual life is supposed to be also.
Yeah. And I liked that metaphor of like just stripping down all the paint that was on that furniture and getting back down to the original wood. My wife has been doing all these estate sales as of late and finding these great antique pieces. She brings them home, and then we fix them up, and we're not sure where we're going to put them yet, but she's found beautiful lamps and little side tables and things that have just, if you go to Walmart and buy one, it's going to last, maybe 5 years, but then you get one of these antiques, and they're meant to go from generation to generation. And
that's right. They've already gone nearly 100 years before you even get them.
Yes, yeah, and they just need a little bit of refinishing, and you bring out the grain in the wood. So that's a metaphor that I also connected with as of late, because we've been working on furniture myself. So it's been fun. Now, you use that illustration of that, great wood being painted over, in your book. What are some modern day paint layers that have been applied to our faith that need stripping away? Do you identify some of those in your book?
Yeah, I would begin with the one that strikes me, at least, as being most prominent. It's the one that's kind of in our face every day in one way or another. It goes under the two-word term Christian nationalism. But I'll just go ahead and say right here on the podcast that what I think it really is, and Robert P. Jones and some others, Sam Perry and some others are the ones that got me thinking about this. I think what we really ought to call it is white non-Christian nationalism. because it really is not akin to the spirit of Jesus, and it is more racially prejudiced and driven than we might like to admit. It's not as faith-based driven as it is racist in its origins. So I think that's probably the dominant one that comes through. It comes through in some of the political wranglings that we are seeing today. It's playing out in a massive action called Project 25. That's just frightening. It's a 900-page, multi-million-dollar funded document about the overthrow of democracy, and the document's very clear about that. I'm not casting aspersions. I'm just telling you what it says. And the leaders in this movement are brazen. So I think we have the right to be equally clear in our resistance to it. I hope we don't end up being mean-spirited, but I do think that we're facing quite a danger. I support a group that started in 1947, the year I was born, believe it or not, called it's a movement called Americans United, and they have a monthly magazine. And my June issue just came today, and it's called Destroying Life and Liberty. So when you say what's painted over, I think we've got a pretty thick layer of this nationalistic spirit. Now, I would add to that, you asked what layers do I see? Underneath that, what we see is something that even goes back farther in history, and that's fascism. And we could play that out in various countries of the world. And we could actually, I think another layer beneath that Walter Brueggemann has identified very helpfully is the whole thing of the whole layer of imperialism. And that goes back into ancient times. So I'm trying to give you short answers to a complicated question and say that I think at base, we're really dealing with human egotism, which I happen to believe is the essence of the fall. We fell when we said, God, I don't need you anymore. I can work this out on my own. And we've been stumbling and paying the price for that choice ever since. And then in ethnocentrism, where we come together in groups and we amplify and multiply that problem, we find ourselves here in North America, in the United States in particular, with a pretty dangerous version of it. And I would say that those are some of the layers. I think some of us probably have also, I made in my notes, I think some of us are also familiar with the whole prosperity gospel movement, where the false allegation that you test God's favor by how many goods and services you can afford or have been given to you. This all strikes me, and I'll generalize and I'll stop and we can talk some more. I think what we're dealing with at base is what I call spiritual entitlement. I deserve this. Yeah. And then different people in groups go on to tell you why they think they do. Divine right, pure church, God's favored people. I mean, the whole thing is an entitlement mentality, and it's raised an ugly head in our day.
Yeah, I definitely see that as well. And you're in good company on this podcast when you mention that. I think I just talked with Grace Ji-Sum Kim, who wrote the book When God Became White. And it was a fantastic book. And that got me really thinking, and the words kind of formed as I was reflecting on her work. The words, Christian nationalism is anti-Pentecost. It's a rebuilding of the Tower of Babel. Because that's that empire, imperial moment. If you read the Bible with the lenses of this is, trying to get through the sin of amassing power for yourself at the cost of another person. And you read the Bible with that lens, and all of a sudden it makes a whole lot more sense.
I think that's true. Yeah, thanks. I've heard the Babel metaphor. It's the connection of a kind of anti-Pentecost is one I'm going to have to think about, because in Jesus Unpainted, the fruit of the Spirit is a Pentecostal outcome when we're filled with the Spirit in love, joy, peace, patience. So this whole Pentecostal metaphor is one that's even implied in Jesus Unpainted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you wrote that regulatory religion was used by the Galatian church. Paul wrote
Yeah,
the epistle to the Galatians to maintain
yes,
power over others, and we've kind of
yeah.
seen that happening today. Like how do we counter that when so much of the church and the regulatory religion or organized religion, how do we counter these anti-Pentecost movements or the rise of Christian nationalism today when so much of the church structure within our nation is in support of it?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm doing my best to be fair in my representations of the things that I am bothered by. I don't want to add to the stereotyping that we already have too much of, and the
Mm-hmm.
stereotyping which comes back to some of us who are more progressive in our faith and treated as if we don't have any faith at all. So I don't want to contribute to that on this podcast, but at the same time, I want to share out of my own experience the struggles with behind the question. And I'm not sure this is a problem that can be laid at the feet of one particular group.
Mm-hmm.
So I just kind of, if the shoe fits, wear it. I think I have encountered and have been treated by people whose minds are so made up they aren't going to change them.
Mm-hmm.
So you say, how do you counter it? There's a level of me that says I don't think you can in those groups.
Yeah.
I'd have to let them tell you how they got to the place where the my way or the highway became the 67th book of the Bible.
Mm.
I don't know how that happened. And as I said it just a minute and a half ago, that can happen as much on the progressive side as on the conservative side. It's a mindset, Tom. It's not something that a particular group cooks up and decides to make their golden calf.
Mm.
But so there are some people. You say, how do we counter it? This is not fatalism and it's not passivity, but I've pretty much given up on that crowd. And what I want to do is to try to write and speak and go on podcasts for what Jim Wallace calls in his book, The White Gospel, the persuadables.
Okay.
I listened to a podcast of his, and somebody asked him about the nuns and duns, and he said that's a good category, and they've studied it. They've got percentages and all this kind of stuff. But he said the language of nun and dun is too final. The nuns final, the duns final. And he said that's not the way I experience these people. I experience them as critics of institutional religion who yet remain open to God.
Mm-hmm.
So his term in the White Gospel book is persuadables. Now, my hope, as my wife Jeannie often says, is that there's more of those folks than there are of the other kind who are going to vote for Donald Trump or support the destruction of life and liberty come what may. I mean, those folks, they're pouring millions of dollars into this campaign. There's over 100 organizations that have self-identified as being a part of it. These folks, short of, the Red Sea parting or something, these folks are going to carry this through because they benefit from it. That's another thing for us to remember is that nationalistic imperialism at the business and educational and political and judicial and congressional, the whole thing, everybody benefits or they wouldn't be for it. See?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you counter it? I think you keep speaking and writing and teaching and going on podcasts and whatever you can, marching, protesting, non-violently. I want to be very clear about that. And if we need to talk about that, we can, because violence is infecting the other side in a way that it must never become part of the resistance that we're talking about. But I think you just have to keep saying it over and over again. Sometimes it takes time for words to sink into some people, where they finally say, wow. See, I wrote today on my Facebook page, if I knew there was over 100 organizations pouring millions of dollars into the production of a 900-page playbook called Project 2025, I'd be concerned about that soon.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that just that little bit might cause somebody to say, "Wow, I've never heard of Project 2025," or "I didn't know there was anything like this going on." See, so you just never know where the tipping point is in someone else's life.
Yeah.
So you keep. Uh, I try to make this very theological, and I'll stop. I tend to go on too long sometimes, but this is where John in the prologue says, the light overcame the darkness. The darkness could not overcome it, could not put it out. Well, that's because light kept being light. Light didn't try to contest the darkness. Light just shines. See, that's what light does. It doesn't argue, it doesn't debate, it doesn't try to take darkness on its own terms. See, rather it shifts the playing field. Says no, we're going to advance on the principles of light. See, so that's how I think we counter it. We keep shining the light. That's what Jesus told us to do.
I really like what you said a couple of minutes back about how they're being so blatant with their saying what they're up to. We might as well be as well on our side of things. And there's like this.
Go ahead.
Well, there in the church, there's like this. Pastors are afraid to say something because it might disrupt the congregation. Or I know that there are I try to remain politically neutral in the pulpit and not say, don't vote for this person, vote for this person. I want to maintain that separation of church and state, knowing that there'll be different groups in there. But if you can't tell who I'm voting for by my preaching, then I'm also doing it wrong, but I don't want to be just so blatant about it. But I try to proclaim, the way of Christ every time from the pulpit. And is there a way to balance that proclaiming something from the pulpit with still maintaining that separation of church and state?
Yes. I heard a story, and I've seen it more than once. So to the best of my knowledge, it actually occurred in a congregation where a pastor deliberately took the Jesus teachings and the Beatitudes and maybe a few other things in the Sermon on the Mount and wove that into a Sunday morning service without any reference to the Sermon on the Mount. He was just talking about we're living in a time when it's important to be humble or make peace or whatever that Jesus talks about. And one of the members came up and said, "Where did you get this stuff?" And he said, "I was hoping somebody would ask this. I got this directly from Jesus. I got this right out of the Sermon on the Mount," hoping that that person would say, "Oh my, we've really got to pay attention to Jesus." But instead said, "Well, Jesus was probably kind of weak-spined and, kind of a lily-livered person. We don't really need to follow him along those lines anymore." I don't know to what extent that story represents the difficulties that pastors have. I taught seminarians for 30 years, and I do know some of them who've lost members. I was talking to one of my graduates some years ago, and he said he was in a congregational system, not an appointed one, where the congregation interviews you and chooses you. And he was burned out, and he said to me, "Steve, they told me they wanted a spiritual leader until I tried to lead them somewhere." Yeah, well, we want a leader, we want a spiritual leader. But every one of them in that room already had their minds made up as to what that was going to mean. See, and so the pastor's almost in a losing situation from the get-go, so far as the spectrum is concerned. So my answer to your question is, how do we pastor our way through that? I think the phrase "speak the truth in love" opens the door. And I read it backwards. That is to say, if people don't know you love them, they won't hear the truth you're trying to speak to them. So I read the verse in reverse. Speak the truth in love, but you start with love to where these people can say, "Well, I don't agree with everything she's saying or he's saying, but that person loves and cares for the flock." And then if that's really the case, and you've got reasonably mature people in the conversation, maybe you can stay in the wrestling match longer when you get to the truth part. See?
Mm-hmm.
And let's be honest, most of the time when we do stay in the ring long enough in the wrestling match, we discover that we don't have all the truth either. See, so that person that seems to be disagreeing with us says something, and we go, "Wow, I never thought about it that way before."
Mm-hmm.
E. Stanley Jones had a concept he called the round table, and everyone was invited to the round table. It had no head, no foot. It was round. So everyone in prospect was a contributor. And the second principle of the round table was put the best you have on the table. Not in a debating sort of way, but if I were to say to you, what's the best part of faith to you? Put it on the table, put it out there. And I'll do the same, and everybody else will do the same. And then we'll see what the Holy Spirit does with the bests that we all put there. Now, I'm sure Jones would have said it didn't always work, but I'm sure there were also God-inspired moments when your best and my best and somebody else's best were mixed together by the Holy Spirit and produced something that kind of left the whole room speechless. I haven't given up on that as a possibility for our history, for the time in which we're going through, but it's not going to be easy to get to that place.
Yeah. You're saying that, that one congregation, they want the leader. Really what I hear is they're looking for like the authoritarian strongman to come in and fight their fight for them, kind of a thing.
Yes.
And that there is like a mentality in Western American evangelicalism that is at war with culture, with society.
Sure.
And I think we've been there since, the Scopes monkey trial in the early 1900s, possibly before, but we're at war with the culture. So we seek to, make a subculture. So you get your science from here, you get your culture from here, your identity from here, your values, your community, schooling, even all from our subculture. And then what I think has been happening since the 1980s with the conservative takeover of the SBC is that subculture is trying to become the dominant culture through this, I think they call it the Seven Mountain plan that they have, where they're going to take the mountains in culture, judicial and entertainment, economic and governmental and whatever else seven ones are.
That's right. That's right. Seven Mountain theology. That's right.
So what is the difference between that kind of like Christian supremacy where my science is better than your science, my theology is better than yours, my God's better than your God, my religion, my spirituality, my sexuality, my identity is all better than yours? What's the difference between Christian supremacy and this early creed that says Jesus is Lord that we find in Philippians?
Okay. Now that's a good question, and I can say on the podcast, thanks for sending it to me earlier today so I could think about it. There are numerous differences, and you know that. So when I go to one, it's only to illustrate and maybe to focus. I think the biggest difference that I see between Christian supremacy and Jesus is Lord theology, the biggest difference is the difference between domination and servanthood.
Okay.
Domination says, really, you're here for me. I'm going to tell you what books you can read, who candidates you're here for me. Dominationism is always an act of a person who wants to rule over someone else. Jesus says, it's in the Gospels, and I'm sorry, but I'm losing the reference. He said, that's the way of the world that wants to lord it over. He said, it will not be so among you. Mm-hmm. So even in the Roman Empire, one of the paradoxes that even some of the Romans saw is that when the Christians came along and said, Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not Lord, they weren't talking about the same Lord.
Mm-hmm.
The Romans were talking about an imperial Lord. The Christians were talking about a towel and basin Lord. The greatest among you will be your servant. Now, fortunately, in Roman history, there are a few emperors. Marcus Aurelius is one that is often pointed to, who saw that through his stoicism. This is not unique to Jesus, is the point.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus bore witness to it, was the incarnation of it, but it didn't. It existed even before he walked the earth. But yeah, I would say that the biggest difference is domination says, you're here for me. Servanthood says, I'm here for you. One is egotism, the other is compassion. And when you play that out, it's a big difference.
Yeah, and it seems like that conservative right, religious, and even republicanism, as we're seeing it in the MAGA party, is they want that domination. They want somebody who will do the dominating for them so then they can dominate with that person. I'm seeing
Sam
that on
Perry,
the right. Yeah.
Sam Perry, Robert P. Jones, and people like that have documented this in our nation's history all the way back to the time of Manifest Destiny, when the Europeans first landed on the coast. The conquistador, that's an interesting word.
I know the word.
Conquistador.
Yeah.
And the whole idea that even though the Native Americans had probably been here for 15,000 years and we had only been here 15 minutes, it's still our country.
Mm-hmm. Doctrine of discovery.
Absolutely. Absolute doctrine of discovery. So all that is a shorthand way of saying on a podcast that we are really in an ideological contest that I think you have to look for summary ways of saying it. I think we're in a contest of whether we believe, I used the word a while ago, whether we come out of an elitist, this is mine, I deserve it, I've worked for it, however it's said, versus people who say we're here for the common good.
Yeah.
Walter Brueggemann has really helped me. He and I email back and forth some, and he's really helped me in his writing and in his emails to see that really is, the roads diverge at that point. Whether the world is my oyster, and so I begin to be a grasper, a consumer, a dominator, or whether I'm part of God's creation and expected not only to receive from it, but to contribute to it as well. Those are two different ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think the indigenous wisdom has something to teach us about that second way.
I absolutely do too. Yes, yeah. I do too.
You talk about God as principle versus God as a person, as the revelation that God is capital B being, not just a force. Can you say some more words around that concept? I think you started to touch on it in your last comment.
Sure. I think that in theology, and I would probably add philosophy that is theistic. Not all philosophy requires God. Some does. But in any theology, philosophy, way of thinking that is supernatural, being is the starting point. That's why I think when Moses in that moment says, I've got to tell these Egyptians, I got to tell them who sent me. I can't just walk in there. I'll last about 15 seconds. Tell me your name. And God does. I'm not sure it was in a way that Moses, did a dance around the burning bush when he heard it, because it was kind of like, thanks for nothing. But it is God's way of saying, I am.
Being.
And whatever else falls under the verb do, comes from am. Do comes from am. There's a cliche that says you are what you do. And that's true. You pattern yourself in a behavioral pattern. You do things over and over again. They'll become routines, and routines become habit. No doubt that's correct. But the deeper principle in theology is you do what you are. So you see, when we say God is love, then everything God does is loving. That's why in Jesus Unpainted, I had a chapter on who Jesus was, the Spirit of the Lord upon him, and that we'll represent that same being and doing dynamic when the Spirit of the Lord is upon us.
Mm-hmm.
It's a holy, I mean, you really do take off your sandals. You are on holy ground because in theology, as Abraham Heschel put it, it's not I, it's I, thou.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why God as principle may get to some good thoughts, not denying that. First principle, that's just a philosophical. But God as first person not only gives us a different angle from which to view God, but then also gives us a different angle to view what our relationship with God would be like. In other words, I know that I'm a person of faith, not because I accept some principles,
Mm-hmm.
but because I'm in relationship with a person, Holy Spirit, human spirit, see. I validate my faith by my relationship, not by the statements of faith that my organization happens to have come up with.
Yeah, which I think can be helpful in so much as they are not gates or walls keeping you inside of something that we have to then police, but more of like a well that you return to that is going to be
Yes,
life-giving. And if
I think that's right. Yeah.
if God is love, as you say, which that's my primary understanding, and love is a verb, and God says, I am who I am in that Moses moment, it sounds like the very being of God is verb-like in love form. And then we reduce that verb to nouns, where, well, God is this and this and this and this. And then when we do that, it's like God as the verb of love has to then take a back seat to our ideas of who God is.
Yep.
And then love is something that God does, when he's not angry with you, or,
Right.
something along those lines.
Yep.
So
this is again where I think our Christology comes into play. And it goes back to some of the things you said about the folks in Galatia who were laying down rules and regulations for the Christians, and Paul comes and says, no, it's not about the laws. It's about love, and that Christ has set us free from the law of sin and death. But what I think is, you can take a list. You could say God is forgiving, God is compassionate, God is all powerful. You can just, anything you want to just start writing out your credo. And there's a kind of intellectualized faith that somebody could look at that and say, I believe every bit of that. But the gospel, the Christian gospel incarnate in Christ says, are you living it?
mm-hmm.
If God is compassionate, am I compassionate? If God is forgiving, am I forgiving? You see, you can intellectualize and turn every truth about God, which you and I would both agree with. We would say, yep, that's right. That's who God is. But Christianity says, okay, hand stays up. Second question, that's who God is. Is it who you are? Is it who I am?
Mm.
Jesus says the Word became flesh. And that, I guess, if I'm going to be over on the side of judgmentalism, that's the thing. And I'll use the LGBTQ issue, for example, where the LGBTQ people themselves hear the language of love without ever feeling that they are loved. See?
Mm-hmm.
So where's the gap? What happened? Well, somebody stopped and said, oh, we love the gays. We love the gays. Checkbox, move on. What's next? War, abortion, what is it? We love the gays. And all the LGBTQ people are saying, well, that's really funny because the day I came out, I was told to clean out my desk and never come back.
Mm-hmm. I was talking with somebody yesterday about churches they say that they're welcoming to LGBTQ individuals, but then they do the bait and switch where they say, you're welcome, to a point, and they feel the welcome, they feel like they're a part of things, and then they say, can I teach Sunday school, or can I sit on the board, or can I, do these things? Oh, no, actually you can't. And
That's right.
like the betrayal that they feel in that moment of, but I thought I was welcomed. I thought this was my community. I thought you loved me. And then to say, well, you're welcome to come here until, you change, or until you stop being who you are.
Yep.
Yeah. And if God
One of
is
my
love, then that shouldn't be the issue for us.
one of my former students and her spouse went online to find in the Orlando area, this is right here in Florida, the churches that online said, all are welcome, we love everyone. And they found a lot of churches that were using that kind of language on their websites. So they made a list of, I don't remember, they made a list of churches that they thought between Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday during Lent. So that'd be 7 weeks times 3, 20, 25 churches. And there were way more than that used the love language. We welcome you. We're a friendly church, all that kind of stuff. You can belong here. But they called the list down and visited those churches one by one during Lent a few years ago. And out of the 25 or so, they found 2. Everyone else had an invisible wall that you hit at some point. Now, this is probably too crass a way to say it, but it's the way it felt on the inside. Some of the churches that said, oh, we welcome everybody, meant you can come and you can listen to the choir, you can listen to the sermons, you can sit in the pews, and oh, by the way, you can give your money.
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty much, for some of them, that's about it. You can come and give, but you can't do much more after that. Now, some churches were a little, you can sing in the choir, but we don't want you working with the youth or the children. I mean, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all barrier. But out of the 25 or so, they found 2 that were not only inclusive. Hearing this changed my whole view. It's not, is the church inclusive? Is the church permissive? I know all kinds of churches say, oh, we're inclusive. We got all kinds of people here. Yeah, but what can they do?
Mm-hmm.
So, I want churches to be inclusive, but I want them to be accepting, but I also want the church to be accessible to all people.
Yeah, that accessibility is a big deal.
Accessibility, absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
not having ramps will keep persons in a wheelchair from getting into some churches.
Yeah.
Not having accessibility in the spirit will keep other people from not being able to get into the church too.
And one you can see before you walk in, and one feels like a betrayal when you find out it's there.
That's right.
Well, I think institutional Christianity is dying if you look at all the data, how it's going. That poses a threat to those vested in the scaffolding that we have built to prop up this institutional religious structure. What do the nuns and the duns have to teach us about where God might be up to? Which I like the different shifting of vocabulary that you used earlier about.
Yeah, I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Let's just call them the persuadables.
Persuadables. What do they have to teach us about what God's up to?
That's Jim Wallace's. That's not Steve Harper's invention. That's when I heard it on the podcast, Jim Wallace using it, I thought, I like that. I'm going to try to start working it into my conversations and my writing.
Yeah.
So let's use that word and come at it from 2 different directions. The persuadables are those people who are trying to persuade us to look at institutional religion in ways that we have tended not to.
Oh, I like that.
So in that sense, they're prophets.
I like that too.
The prophets were trying to persuade the nation to see themselves in ways they were not willing to admit. So the first role, the nuns and duns, the persuadables, is they've come out and saying, are you really ready to hear what we experienced the legalism, the judgmentalism, the mean-spiritedness, the text messages that were left on our phones, I've just heard even at worst case scenario, death threats, language of abomination. The West Point Baptist people who showed up. It just runs the gamut. These are the people who said, we just look at that and we look at Jesus and we don't see those things as having anything to do with each other. So the persuadables, the first thing is they're trying to persuade us to have eyes to see and ears that hear, Jesus talks about in Mark chapter 8. Rather than drawing our robes of righteousness around them, and as Jesus said to the Pharisees, laying burdens on people you yourselves are not willing to carry. My God.
Mm-hmm.
Laying it on folks in ways you never lay it on yourself. Have you ever noticed that the judges are always on the right side of the judgment?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
The judge is never throwing dust up in the air and says, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips and I dwell in the people of unclean lips. No, the judge is always the one who's got it right. See?
Yeah.
Woo, that's
because they're on the pedestal.
Interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
So the first thing that the persuadables are trying to do is to persuade us. Now, in that conversation, to try to hold them and not lose them entirely, we're trying to persuade them that there is another way to be Christian than the way they may have experienced it. And somewhere we're praying and hoping, believing that the Holy Spirit will be at work in their persuasion of us and our persuasion of them. And out of that Saturday tomb-like experience, there can be a resurrection of a new kind of church. And I'm 77. I will be 77 in October. I won't see most of that. Things don't happen that quickly. But if you say, do you have hope? I absolutely do. And it's not just because of some of the good signs I see around me, but because this cycle of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, what Richard Rohr calls order, disorder, reorder, it's happened before. We're in bad shape, but we're not in any worse shape than other people have been in the past. And by the grace of God, there is a Sunday, there is a day of resurrection. But that requires people who are willing to see the body of Christ, literally, the body of Christ differently. Mary Magdalene wanted to grab on, and Jesus said, don't hold me, don't hold me. Jesus could still eat and drink, but he could also walk through walls.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a minute. Something new is going on here. So I think one of the marks of your question about how do we get past this institutional quagmire is to ask ourselves, how willing am I to embrace a different kind of Jesus than I may have experienced in the past? That's a question for an elder in the United Methodist Church who, professed faith in Jesus when I was 15 years old and I'm 76. And that's a question that maybe the nuns and duns who walked out last Sunday and said, I'm never coming back. We all have to ask that question. Is a new Jesus something I am willing to see?
Yeah. And I've been exploring as I talk with people who, say, I'm done, I'm out. And I get to know their story.
That's right.
Like the essence of love in their life is still there. The essence of
That's right.
wanting to do good in the world, and everything that they thought it was to be a Christian, which they were spot on what it was to be a Christian, and then were proven wrong when they showed up on a Sunday and said, "Oh, this is something very different." I found that there's like a very big difference between the label we slap on something and what is inside the jar of what the label has. And a lot of things are labeled Christian, but then you open up the jar and you find out, oh, there's Christian, non-Christian nationalism in here, or there's, fundamentalism in here, or this isn't Christian. But then you find somebody who puts a label on themselves as deconstructed or done with church or spiritual but not religious, and then they're not perfect by any means, but then you get to the essence of their life and you say there's a lot more Christ likeness to them now that they're gone and out of the
Oh,
institutional than
yeah,
what is on the inside, because the contents are really what matters, not the label you slap on the outside.
that's so true, Tom. That is so true. Um, I've been shaped by the Wesleyan tradition, which is itself eclectic. It's not just a one string tradition. But here's the way I tried to say it to students when I was teaching. In this time when so many people are saying, I'm spiritual but not religious, in this time when so many people are not wanting to have very much, if anything, to do with institutional religion, Christianity, usually I'm thinking of, but it can be other faith traditions. A lot of Jews are not practicing Jews. I mean, there's just a whole institutional pushback right now that say, no, I don't want anything to do with that. In the Wesleyan tradition, I've said earlier in the podcast, Christ is the center. Our Christology is where we begin. Seeing Jesus of the Gospels, not necessarily Jesus of history, but Jesus of the Gospels. But that's got to land somewhere. Otherwise, it's just sitting there. Jesus is the center. And you go, okay, cool. That lands for Wesleyans in the Imago Dei, the image of God, which we don't believe was totally lost in the fall. Damaged but not destroyed, yes. So what does that mean for Starbucks coffee conversation? It means not starting with the Roman road of salvation, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but Jesus has come. And it means saying, what kind of life do you enjoy living the most? And they'll say, well, I enjoy having fun. Yeah, me too. Or, what do you think about people? Should they be honest or dishonest? Oh, they should be honest. See, this may be a person who left the church after being there for a long time, or a person who's never walked in for the first time, but they just have something inside. Honesty, trustworthiness, not being taken advantage of. You can have a whole conversation, never mention the name of Jesus one time, and the whole thing's has been Christ-like. That's where I have hope. We can have conversations with people. If you said, how come you don't go to church anymore? They'd bristle and say, well, I don't want that. I want what I call, and I do call it, I call it abundant life evangelism. I want to start by saying, hi, my name's Steve. What's yours? And they, and that person, maybe I know them, maybe I don't. And I say, what are you enjoying about life these days? Say, well, I've got a great family. What makes it a great family? So that's Imago Dei, just calling out. And at some point, this is in the Wesleyan theology of prevenient grace. See, at some point, that interior creationism becomes a place where you can say, Jesus is about that. Everything you've talked about that makes you happy, that gives you purpose, that makes you feel safe and not threatened, all those things that give you the good life, Jesus is the good shepherd of that life, and he can lead you into more of it. Oh my. Oh my.
I like that Imago
That's a whole lot
Dei as a
different
verb.
than starting out with this gap between hell on the one side and heaven on the other side, and saying Jesus is the bridge that can get you from one to the other.
Mm-hmm.
But right now you're over here.
Yeah.
See,
I grew up
think
with that
where
image.
people are, I think where people are is they're hungry and thirsty for God by whatever instinct they call that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's go for it.
Yeah. That they're hungry and thirsty for God, and then what they see being served up in, the localized religious structures is not that at all.
No.
They think it is because it's labeled that way. And they say,
That's right.
I must not want anything religious because look at all this stuff. And I mean, there's something to that because it is very, widespread. This Christian nationalism is taking root so much in fundamentalism. You show up in any Bible believing, in air quotes, country church, and you're going to find a very fundamentalist, angry looking God that's after everybody who's not doing it the way that they're doing it. And your book goes backwards and kind of like unpaints all of that stuff off of this beautiful piece of furniture that we call the Christian faith. But we can't just go backwards. We also have to contextualize it in the world that we do live in. And how do we do that without putting more paint layers on it? You know, what might a church community look like that has its roots in that vision, but is also very mindful of the world that we live in today and tries to contextualize it? What kind of vision do you see there?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with a reference to the Wesleyan tradition only because it's helped me to process that kind of a question.
Okay.
Charles, in the hymn, A Charge to Keep, says that we are called to serve the present age. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. The Wesleys understood that any gold they find in the past is meant to be, I'll say it this way, any gold they found in the past is supposed to be jewelry in the present.
Oh, that's a really good image.
You're supposed to make it into something. So it's not just supposed to be a glob of gold. It's supposed to be a watch or a utensil. So the present age is where the truth of the gospel comes alive. Otherwise, it's back to principle again. See, it's a great principle. Oh, wow. God is love. Ooh, that's really something. But you move that into the present day, and it's not only something, it's transforming. It's life-giving. So what I think, and again, I'm 76, and I'm not pastoring churches today and haven't for a long time. Most of my friends are still in active ministry, the students I've taught, so I try to listen to them. And what I'm hearing, first of all, comes from my friend and colleague, Bishop Will Willimon, who says that this next 5 to 10 years, when this reconstruction of Christianity is occurring, this new awakening, whatever you want to call it, we've got to focus on locality. That doesn't mean that we're not going to support missions and missionaries. It doesn't mean that we're not going to give to relief organizations or World Central Kitchen or whatever it is. We're going to do that, but our focus is going to be on the people in our proximity, because we aren't going to, there's not anybody in Norway that's going to come to my church next Sunday. But the people who live 3 blocks away might, or the people who run the small businesses, the mom and pop stores 3 blocks away might. So Willimon says, and I quote him because I think he's correct, is that the renaissance of the church is paradox. We win the world by serving our particular portion of it. Do you remember the ad that AT&T did some years ago when the guy's standing there and he's throwing cards out on a map of the United States? And he keeps throwing cards until almost the whole map is covered in AT&T cards. But each card is only this big. See, no one card covers the country. But when you throw out 10,000 cards, you've got coverage. You've got a network. I was teaching that before I retired. I think that's our job, is to figure out our card and toss it out there. And believe that in 100 and something thousand other Christian congregations, other people are doing that same thing until, man, what a coverage area, see. Now, where that intersects with another person of mine is Eugene Peterson. In his book, The Contemplative Pastor, he developed what he calls the pastor's question. He said every local pastor should be asking this question. Who are these people? These people. And how can I be with them so that they can become what God is making of them by grace? See? The focus is not ignoring the world, but it's serving the parish. So that I taught a D-Min class on what I call social spirituality, and we talked about Wesley and all that stuff. And then I had them, they go back and to their projects and that sort of thing. And I said, I want you to interview somebody who's in education, can be a principal, a teacher, Can be, I want you to talk to the person who's your city commissioner. I want you to talk to a doctor or to a firefighter, some public safety person. You pick them. And I just want you to go and say to them, how can the church, which is within 2 miles of here, help you? And I got a lot of interesting conversation, comments in the papers that they wrote. But you know what the thread was that ran through it all? Between the teachers, the firefighters, the doctors, the city commissioners, the thread that ran through it all is, it's the first time in my life somebody from a church has ever asked me that question.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been, what can you do for me? Can you come to my church? Can you get active? Can you usher? Can you sing in the choir? Can you give your money? Can you serve on a board or committee? Every conversation I've ever had with the church was what the church wanted me to do for them. You're the first person that comes saying, what can we do for you?
Yeah.
Now I'm telling you, you say, well, man, no telling what that would do. That's right, because we really haven't tried it.
Yeah.
we don't really know what it would do. But one of my students was in tears. One of my students was in tears because he talked to a doctor and ran an ER where people were living and dying right in front of him every single day. And he just said, I don't even know how to answer your question because nobody from the church has ever asked me this before. Well, who are these people and how can I be with them so that they can become what God seeks to make of them by grace? That's Eugene Peterson's pastor's question.
I like Eugene Peterson a lot.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word parish, and I've kind of adopted the parish mentality in my role as pastor here. We're in a small town, maybe 1,500 people. We're right on Main Street. We're a small church, maybe 40 to 50 people on a Sunday. But I've adopted the parish mentality that if you live in this zip code, you're in my parish. I will meet the spiritual needs of you without expectation that you need to be at my church on Sunday. And that has really transformed like how I interact with people out in the business leaders and the city council members and the teachers and it just changed everything where you're in my parish, so I'm responsible for your spiritual health. Whether you're going to show up on Sunday or not, I want to help you.
I think that's my answer to your question. How do we get back into this thing in a meaningful way? Now, I think there are going to be people, and they're bishops in the United Methodist Church, they're bishops and district superintendents and general secretaries of boards and agencies. There are people who are called to tend to the structure. They are. I'm not putting that down in any way, shape, or form, because I've got friends in all those places who are as devoted to Jesus as you and I would ever want them to be or hope they would be. So there are callings that do deal with infrastructural change. But I'm talking about the local parish pastor. I got the idea for this in a social ministry in New York called the Harlem Zone. I think you can Google it. I didn't do that today, this may be 20 years ago now. A group of people took it wasn't even a church. It was kind of a community service organization. And they took their building. They went a mile out in radius in all directions, drew a circle, and said, we're going to take responsibility for this territory. This is our parish, to use your language there. We're going to walk the beat. We're going to get to know who the 7-Eleven attendants are. We're going to get to know who the teenagers are working at Sonic and Dairy Queen. We are going to know these people. And with that spirit of, how can we help you? How can we help you to thrive? I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. How can we help you do that? And trust the Imago Dei. They weren't using all this theological language. They were just saying, we'll go out and, we'll see somebody. That person doesn't have a home. That person doesn't have good clothing. That person needs a haircut. That person needs this. That person needs that. you don't see anything when you don't look. See,
Mm.
so that whole idea of Harlem Zone, I thought, wow, what if every church in the United States had a zone, and you talk to it in your administrative board meetings, and you talk about it in your Sunday school classes, and little by little, you get to know that territory. And I don't care whether it's a mile out or 2 miles, the way people come and commute these days, you might draw the circle differently. But rather than saying, well, we give to missions and we're involved in all United Way and all this kind of stuff. No, what's your zone, man? Are you in the zone? I think I'd preach a sermon. Are you in the zone? Because if you could get 100,000 plus churches in the zone, man, that's the Great Commission. You'd be going into all the world and you'd never be more than 2 miles away from your church.
I like that. Now, the kind of leader that needs to do that is one that would be dedicated to gentleness and not that authoritarian strong man. And you said that gentleness is love doing no harm. In a world where there is so much abuse from our leaders, and it seems like a new one comes out every day, what does a gentle leader look like in an embodied in our church space and in our neighborhoods?
I think that a gentle leader. I'll start by saying is a healthy human being, so that if there are unresolved issues and unfinished business in some person's life, you don't get around that just by saying, well, God called me into ministry and that'll all be taken care of. As Richard Rohr says, hurting people hurt other people. So I think a gentle leader doesn't really even start with the people that he or she's leading. I think you start with yourself. And so the healthiest leaders I know right now, many of them have spiritual direction, spiritual guides they meet with periodically, if not regularly. Some of them are in actual therapy because the woundedness that they bring into ministry is substantial. In other words, the gentle leader begins with your own person. Be kind to yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Whoa. I think most psychologists will say that's actually what we end up doing. We tend to love others the way we love ourselves. Mm-hmm. If we're hard on ourselves, we're hard on others. Da 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 da.
Yeah.
The other is that I think the gentle leader leads in community and takes counsel from the community. I say that because we went through a period, since I moved to Florida, we went through a period down here in this part of the country where there was a lot being said about visionary leadership. And some of the pastors in this area were saying, we're the visionaries. We pray, we receive the vision, we go tell the people what it is, then they support it and pay for it. I don't think that's visionary leadership. I don't think that's visionary leadership. I think visionary leadership says, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? Talk to me. Tell me. How do you see this? How do you feel? And the leader's processing. The leader's not just a proclaimer. The leader's a processor. So that, you may not ever say it out loud, but over and over you're going, go ahead and thought of that. Oh, wow, that's a good idea. So that your leadership is emerging out of a multifaceted discernment process of what's beautiful, good, true, important, timely, whatever it is. So gentle leadership is first caregiving, self-care. Then it's taking counsel. Then I think gentle leadership is, as soon as you're aware of it, acknowledging your mistakes and asking for forgiveness. Rather than saying, well, I wouldn't have said that or done that if he or she, some leaders go immediately into a blame game. That's just preserving a false ego, see? Rather than saying, no, you're right, I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. If I had to do it over again, I wouldn't do it that way. Will you forgive me and help me start over? And maybe the second time around we'll get there. We didn't get there this time. Maybe we will next time. Cultic type leaders don't do that. Tom, you know that. You've studied toxic leadership enough. The demagogue is the last one to fall. I think Jesus says the leader's the first one to fall on our knees with the towel in the basin in servanthood, going to the cross, saying to people who are trying to put him on a pedestal like Jesus, why do you call me good? No one's good but God. Let's get this straight. Jesus is constantly being very human in a holy sort of way. And I think gentle leaders are human in a holy sort of way.
I like that. Human in a holy sort of way. Just like, yeah, I like that. Well, Steve, this has been a really fun conversation after we worked out our technical difficulties, and I'm glad it did resolve, and we got a great conversation today. What's the best way for folks to connect with your work and what you're doing and writing in this world? Where do you want to send them?
Probably the best way, well, I'll give two ways. Start with the simpler one first. The simpler one is I have a little Facebook page called Little Lights. Now, if you go on, you're going to find some other little lights. I thought I was being real creative, and I'm just about the 200th person to think of that. So, you may have to search until I've got a little picture of myself in the profile with a little cap on, and there's a picture of a river. You'll know when you're there. It's not the kind of a profile you go, well, I don't know whether that's him or not. You'll know, but it's called Little Lights. Little Lights. And it's a daily little short meditation medium that I use every day. Got about 2,000 people involved in that right now. The more substantive one is called Obodire, O-B-O-E, like the oboe. Obodire, O-B-O-E-D-I-R-E. That's obodire.com. And I've been doing that since 2010. And that's where you can really connect with other of my writings and thoughts. But it's also got an email address that you can use to be in touch if you want to. Little Lights, you can message, the private messaging thing on Facebook. So either way, you can be in touch. Little Lights is kind of an everyday thing. Obodire is a little more substantial. But both of those have ways that we can be in touch. If anybody's listened or watched the show today, wants to interact, I'd be happy to do that.
All right. Well, I'll put links down in the notes so it'll be easy for people to find you. They just got to click on it and they'll take them right there.
Cool.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Liminal Living Podcast. It has been a joy to talk with Dr. Steve Harper today. Just hearing about his wisdom and his courage, his faithfulness over the course of his career, paired with a commitment to love, transformation, and it just proves to be like a life-giving truth that challenges in helpful and courageous ways the things that need to be changed. So if you found today's discussion meaningful, I encourage you to check out Steve's blog and his author's webpage on Amazon, where you can find his many, many books, including the one we talked about today, Jesus Unpainted, which at the time of this recording, it's on sale for only 99 cents for a digital copy. Also, you can find some newer books of his. It Is Finished, God's Universal Salvation, as well as Holy Love, A Biblical Theology for Human Sexuality. Now remember, you can find a link to all these resources from today's episode in the show notes down below. So if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Liminal Living on your favorite podcast platform. Leave us a review, share it with friends and family. Also, if you'd rather see the video of this episode, you can head over to YouTube, watch it there. Make sure you subscribe there. Your support helps us continue to bring these wonderful conversations out into the public sphere. And remember to stay connected with us on Facebook so that you know when new episodes drop and you can kind of see some stuff on future episodes and some conversations on upcoming content. So as always, we value any feedback or suggestions you have. If they are coming from a non-trolling place, they are more than welcome. So they help me think through my thoughts. And yes, so until next time, I am Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations, reminding you to embrace the liminal spaces of your life. So let's keep exploring, questioning, and growing together. Peace out.